to the African Integration Forum. Today is March 27th, 2021, and we are live in Massachusetts. My name is Ishmael Serunjoji. I would like to send a very big thank you to our panelists tonight who made time to be here with us to discuss the human rights crisis in Uganda. I'd like to introduce Ms. Helen Epstein, who is an author of Another Fine Mess, America and Uganda and the War on Terror. She's a frequent contributor to the New York Review books and other publications. She has served as a consultant to the Human Rights Watch, UNICEF, and other international organizations, and currently teaches in human rights programs, the Human Rights Program at Bard College in New York. Welcome, Helen.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I would like to also introduce Dr. Businje Slivio Mbabazi. Dr. Businje is a former head of Tri-Advocacy LDC and a counsel for former counsel for International Criminal Court. She's welcome, Slivio.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Ismail, nice to be here.
Nice to have you, Slivia. Then Nicholas. Nicholas is a member of the European Parliament. He sits on 3 committees: the Committee on Constitutional Affairs, the Committee on Regional Development, and the Committee on Culture and Education. Nicholas is also very passionate about the youth and also very passionate about green, the ecology and environment and space. Welcome, Nicholas.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, and thank you guys for making the time. I will dive right into with you, Nicholas. I know on the 11th of February, the EU passed a resolution where you stood up on the floor of Parliament and made a very big speech condemning the human rights violation in Uganda. And I'll quote something that I found that you said. If the acting president, Yoweri Museveni, is to dispel doubts about his legitimacy, new elections must be held. Violence against opposition politicians and demonstrators must end immediately. Uganda must allow independent observers from the United Nations, the African Union, and other partners. All the things you said in this continue going on in Uganda even as we speak, because we have a lot of people that have been abducted. We have there's a kid, a 14-year-old kid that is held in a high-end prison for convicts. Somebody will say that this is just talk. What's your take on that, Nicholas?
Yeah, well, probably if you say that's all talk, it's not even that wrong. You know, I mean, we have to look at the facts, and that's also a piece of the speech that I made, is that we just don't have to only talk as the European Union, but also place the action where our mouth is. And the European Union as a whole has condemned the election as it was going forth, because we saw previously already that the opposition was suppressed, that they didn't have the possibility to have a fair election campaign, that supporters were beaten up by security forces and so on. So from the very start, we knew this cannot be a fair and free election. And so we condemned it from the start, and then we condemned it afterwards as well. But then I criticized very much that the follow-up is missing. And this is really a very slippery slope where we want to ensure that we continue to have good connections to Uganda as a whole, but to still force the president to act as a democratic in the democratic manners. And so what you just mentioned, with the situation actually continuing or even worsening than previously, we still have to find a good leverage to actually act on that. And what we're doing at the moment is to get in contact with our diplomats, and actually our diplomats on the ground have already been in contact with the opposition. We're highly criticized by the government for that. But we still say in a democratic Uganda, it's very clear that diplomats can talk to everyone who is elected, be they part of the government or the opposition. And so we're trying to go in this direction, but we really want to find ways that do not hurt the people the most, because this is a little bit the fear that we have, and that's why I'm very much interested in your points also on what the European Union and the member states of the European Union can do to support the democratization process in Uganda, but still not hurt the people on the ground. Because let's face it, if we have sanctions, they're not going to hurt Museveni and his folk. In the end, it's going to hurt the Ugandan people the most, and that's not what we want at all. I mean, that's not the use of it.
Yeah, and speaking about sanctions, I'll put it to you that if the sanctions are individualized under the Magnitsky Act, we had somebody here on last show, and he said, even though the talks are going on, these countries still support the generals. They still give their kids visas to attend. They still allow them to own property in the different countries. They still, even if we stand up, even if you, Nicholas, you and Ugandans have a very high respect for you. You're such you're a celebrity, so to speak. But the feeling is that even if you speak 3 days later, it's very easy for somebody to go to the embassy of, say, Belgium and apply for his whole family to come, and he will own a flat easily. So the follow-up is really lacking. Helen, I want to bring you up on this point. What's your take on that?
Yeah, I think broadly, sure. I mean, we in the United States, for example, provide hundreds of millions of dollars to Uganda each year for AIDS treatment programs and malaria programs and things. We certainly don't want to interfere with those. But what the United States, I think, is considering doing, and which I hope they'll do, is look critically at all the different areas of foreign aid that we give, and see whether there aren't certain things that can be targeted. For example, our military assistance. We have training partnerships, hardware donations and sales and so on that go on, and that the Europeans and the Americans support. And we need to really, 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 in a very big way, start rethinking those. Americans actually have two or three forward operating bases from our AFRICOM program, which is the U.S. Africa Command, actually has 3 forward operating bases inside Uganda. And where we work, unfortunately, with some of the very brutal security forces that are responsible for horrific attacks on innocent Ugandans, simply because they're opposition supporters. The head of the land forces in Uganda, General Peter Elwelu, yes, commanded a massacre of 150 people in Western Uganda a few years ago, which included a number of small children under 12. So we really need to think our partnerships, particularly in the defense area, and other strategic trade relationships also. And also sanctions against individuals who may send their families abroad or come to visit the West or have holdings in Western banks and so on. So I think those are the kinds of places I would look for sanctions. We have to be very targeted about it because it's a special case.
Thank you very much, Helen. And speaking of targeted, I will again quote from the EU resolution. And for those who are watching us, the EU resolution was on Uganda, Rwanda, and Kazakhstan, right, Nicholas? And
yeah, we had different resolutions, all supported on the same day for these 3 countries, which interestingly have similar problems actually going on. But obviously, we stated them on the 3 different occasions because they're still 3 different countries with very different situations, even though they all belong to the case of election fraud.
Yep, thank you. And I'll quote something that was written about Uganda on the resolution, that Parliament reiterates that Parliament reiterates that the sanctions against individuals and organizations responsible for human rights violations in Uganda must adopt to the new EU rights sanction mechanism, the so-called EU Magnitsky Act. I would like to bring in Slivia. As a former ICC Council and as a person who was in charge of drafting the Torture Act in Uganda, do you think that having these targeted sanctions could shake the dictatorship in Uganda?
Now, I would like, first of all, to agree with Nicholas and Helen. When you look at these sanctions, they are intended actually to have a certain result. Sometimes negatively, you'd think it's to bring the country on their knees. But if you look at other aspects, sanctions can help also like reduce or remove human rights violations. But the nature of sanctions are the things you should look at, like Helen said. There are those that are comprehensive. We have comprehensive, we have sectarial sanctions, and we have incomprehensive sanctions. So where do we get the peak? Like Nicola said, you don't want to hurt the people by actually having sanctions that are actually going to affect the actual victims who are the beneficiaries of the aid of those particular or the particular help that comes from either the UN, the US, or any of these countries that are giving Uganda aid. So I think we have to be very mindful here when we're picking which particular sanctions. And you talked about looking at individuals, and that is going to lie in the incomprehensive sanctions. We look at individuals and particular organizations that are actually involved in the human rights violations. And in this scenario, we have, like, you can name out, like we have major generals, we have army officers, people who are actually involved into these torture activities, and we have organizations. And when we are looking at the sanctions, I think I would marry my opinion with Helen's, that let's look at things like weapon embargoes. Yeah, weapon embargoes. Yeah, Uganda gets a lot of weapons from the US. Yeah. If we are going to look at generally like sanctioning and looking at aid as general, you realize that Uganda, almost 20% of the Ugandan GDP depends on what? On aid from abroad. And Uganda stands to lose like 500 billion shillings every year if it doesn't have like a good relationship with the European Union, because the European Union is one of the Uganda's development partners, one of the biggest Uganda's development partners. So at the end of the day, Ismail, what we're looking at is how can we do this without actually hurting the victims you're trying to protect? The victims, you may take away the human rights, like the torture, but you're going to kill them of either hunger, like the ones of HIV, you're going to kill them of disease. So we have to be very mindful in choosing what kind of sanctions we are going to look at. And my main worry actually is when you bring in sanctions, your aim, are you sure how much are you going to achieve by using sanctions? Because if you look at the arrogance already of our president, who says they may not need aid from abroad. He doesn't have to fly abroad. He only does it for friendship. If I'm to quote some of his speeches, that they don't even see a reason for them to fly. But if you look at what is happening in Uganda, these are the people who have their kids study abroad. They have like when they're sick, they use hospitals abroad. So believe me, I think this is just a bluff. So while we are doing this, how much are we going to achieve, and in what areas are we going to achieve? Thank you.
I think my the question now would be, the United States gives Uganda $950 million annually, and this goes through different projects, just like Helen said, and it's supposed to be monitored by the USAID and the US mission in Uganda. The EU gives a very big chunk of money, but the processes that are already there between Businje and Helen, who has worked in Uganda, and probably Nicholas, clearly you haven't been to Uganda, you know that this money doesn't reach the people that it's supposed to go to. We know that even if they continue giving this money, they always go to the workshops. They have different workshops. They buy big cars. Helen, you're smiling. You know this. You've worked in Uganda. $950 million. They may end up using only 50 million. The rest goes into the hands of the permanent ministry, the different workshops, per diems, and blah 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 blah. Why don't somebody else would say, why don't we put this to a stop? Because the same money that we sent, the 950 million, why don't we put it to a stop? Then I'll tell you this, Nicholas, if you didn't know, the daughter of the president of Uganda, I think it was Natasha, please, Livia, correct me if I'm wrong, had to fly just to give birth, had to fly to Brussels, had to fly to Brussels to give birth. But yet, Uganda has the highest infant mortality rate on the continent. So my question to you, and again, I'm coming to Nicholas, how far do we need to go with this aid? What's the purpose of the aid if it's not really getting to, we're trying to protect the masses, but they're not getting the aid? How far should we need to go? Do we cut, is there a question of cutting the aid? Is there a question of improving the monitoring? What would it be?
I think it's rather the latter, right? Because if we're cutting the aid, of course, the first, we had that exercise through. It will hurt the only maybe 15 million that go on. They will be lost first, because the elites will keep the money that they need in order to fly to Brussels or wherever and have their yachts and so on. So I think what we actually need to do, and this is a very much longer process that we need, not just for Uganda, but in general with humanitarian aid, the question of how do we want to distribute the money, and do we need to go through the governments, of which we know that a lot of them, not all of them, are corrupt, and that a lot of funds are actually getting lost in the way by whomever, right? So why not see to spend the money directly into the communities and on the people? And I think first of all, there has to be a change in the view of how we also as Europeans see the instrument of humanitarian aid. Because let's make no mistake, the previous model of humanitarian aid is a very post-colonial one, which just says, okay, we give you money, so we have you a little bit under control. And this is not something that we should go in the direction of, but rather just see it as a responsibility and a real, how do you say that in English? Reparations for the destruction that was made from European as well as American and northern countries towards the south, in order to say, okay, we are not giving it for you to control the country, but rather to build it up and to pay reparations for the destruction that we have caused. And then with that money, that should rather go to the people directly. And in Germany, in Europe, I'm working on regional development, in which we try to leverage the economic changes or differences in Europe. And we saw a model in which functions in a similar way, in which you give a community a certain fund, and they can democratically decide what to do with the money. All of them have to say yes to a project in order for it to be built. So when the community wants to build, for example, a hospital, they all have to agree on it, and then you can build the hospital. But not one person can say, I want to build a shop and I get 5 million for it, and then money gets lost in the process. I think something like that should be envisioned to give support for the global south. And I think that would be much of improvement, because it will better the economic situation of everyone living in the countries, and it will also place us not in such a harsh rule as we have it at the moment, to say we cannot just simply cut funding because it will hurt the wrong people. And it would also give us a much more leverage for putting on sanctions on individuals, because then a sanction actually means something, because otherwise you have still the aid and a chunk of money that's still floating in the country, and maybe the people can't travel to Europe anymore. So what? I mean, they don't really care about that. Let's face it, right? It's a good question. I think we still should do it, but in an extreme situation like this, I think that would be more helpful. So to renew the aid program that we have, the humanitarian aid, and make it real aid and not control mechanisms. And for that, and then have sanctions that to put action where our mouth is. And I criticize the European Commission for that in particular, because we didn't do it in the past, because it's a very hard process to do it in Europe. The US is way better with putting up sanction and putting action to their words. But at least maybe you have followed the discussion concerning China. Finally, we have put up sanctions for the first time in 30 years concerning human rights violations in China, which is one of the biggest, the biggest economy, or second biggest economy still, but soon to be biggest. And so it's very hard to put sanctions against them. So I hope that this will continue, and to really value the human rights for which we stand in our communication, to also value that with sanctions and with action and with economic support.
I think the model. Thank you, Nicholas, for that. That was a very good piece of education. But for Uganda's case and for a dictator, this is a guy that even when Bobiwine, the Honorable Chagulanyi, was going to the EU offices, they blatantly beat up people, journalists, outside the offices. This is a dictatorship that made sure that the civil society organizations were stopped, that were getting aid from DGF and all these other guys they were stopped. Helen, do you think that this model could actually work in Uganda? Because it could. There are things that we can adopt from the US, from the EU, but for dictatorships that don't really care what happens to the person, just like they don't really care about whether you get sick or not.
Yeah.
Do you think this model can work, Helen?
I think it's a great idea. I think it's a tricky one for obvious reasons. But the idea of targeting aid to small groups is potentially, if you can find a way of doing it efficiently without requiring too much labor on the part of the donor, I can see that as a wonderful idea. For example, what we saw, for example, with COVID-19 is when it broke out, there was a lot of concern about how it was going to affect Africa. We didn't know whether it would spread as rampantly there as it has elsewhere. And the IMF and the World Bank mobilized billions of dollars for developing countries, particularly in Africa, for COVID relief and for stabilizing their balance of payments and all that sort of stuff. And what happened in Uganda is that the World Bank, the IMF opened a $500 million loan facility. Some of that money apparently went through the World Bank. $300 million apparently arrived in Uganda as a loan and went direct into the security forces, into a classified military budget. And nobody knows what it's being spent on, but it's probably being used to clobber up the opposition. And it's an absolute disgrace. And some of us have tried to campaign to get the World Bank to sort of explain themselves about this. They've been utterly silent about it. And it's really pretty outrageous. So this idea that you can just mobilize funds and throw them out the door, that really needs to stop. We need to, at some level, whether we adopt a model like the one Nicholas has been talking about, or some other one, we really need to dispense with the one we have, because it's really just in a country like Uganda, it's a disaster.
I would like to come in there, Ismail, a little bit before we lose that point. Actually, Helen, I have been in the human rights business for a very long time. I used to work, when I left law school, actually, I went to Foundation for Human Rights Initiative, and I was into very advocacies and campaigns. And we used to have like organizations, NGOs being funded directly. Then eventually they introduced something called Human Rights Network, then the Human Rights Basket. And before we knew it, the Human Rights Basket eventually, I think now was controlled by the government. I think if we were to go back to where we started, I think, Helen, you've been in Uganda for a long time. Believe me, I think direct contact with the NGOs, I think, was much better, because you'd even have the opportunity to go to the grassroots level. Right. Actually, campaigns were done right from the grassroots level. Funding was done right from the grassroots level. But if you say that, I think initially, the donors thought they were relieving themselves by having a human rights basket where everybody's going to tap. But little did they know that the basket now turned out to be now the government basket. I think we should be going back to where we started in the human rights. Yeah.
Absolutely. This explains a great deal. I hadn't know that, but I did notice a shift in the tone of a lot of human rights activity in Uganda, and it must have been because of that.
Yeah. And just maybe something small about a comment on what Nicholas was saying. When I look at Uganda, it takes me back to, by the way, Ismail, I worked in the Office of the Public Counsel for Defense in the ICC. And I learned a lot of things because that time we had a self-referral. Uganda had a self-referral of Joseph Kony. Actually, Uganda was the first country to have a self-referral in the ICC. And I kept on wondering, what is going to happen? And I thought that initially I thought that maybe ICC is going to come to Uganda, maybe find a way of arresting Joseph Kony, until I was educated on the fact that, the ICC doesn't have an army, it doesn't have a police. So it is up to that country to actually arrest their own person and present the person to what? To the ICC. So, and they used to ask us about evidence. We have to get evidence, not even in Uganda, like the evidence is overwhelming. Right now, Helen, you can agree with me. When it comes to human rights violations, it's overwhelming. You don't have to actually even look for it. It is there, even a baby can see it. But why doesn't like the European Union, Nicholas, instead of looking on cutting of funds, why don't you look at dialogue or impose other functions? Make referrals. We have the UN, you have the UN system, make referrals. Can we have another case from Uganda? For me, that is one of the aspects I'm looking at, besides looking at the sanctions. I'm looking at weapons, embargoes, like embargoes against weapons, looking at individual, actually. If we go and freeze the accounts of those individuals involved, those who are involved in the human rights violations, these people have bank accounts abroad, they have businesses abroad. And we also look at other avenues. It doesn't have to be the European Union or America only. We have companies that can impose sanctions. You know what happened in Uganda? The internet was switched off during the elections. Who has the power over the internet?
It's still switched off right now.
Thank you. Yeah. The company in charge of internet, can't it impose its own sanctions, bearing in mind that we have maybe like the nationals who should not be affected? We have other people who can have those sanctions, not specifically the European Union and the America.
Nicholas, you want to come back on that?
I really want to come back, especially on the ICC question, and I think the ICC is such a glorious idea, and it should be used way more efficiently. But for that, it must be also it has to show that it is functioning. I think the processes so far have shown that there's a need for the ICC and that it's working. But I think what we need more than that is actually to commit, as even, as the strong players in the world, especially the US, to commit to the ICC and to say, yes, we also follow the rule and we will also apply these rules in our region. I mean, there is I think the Den Haag rule in the US, something in the military operation that the military has the power to invade Den Haag and bring every US citizen out of the prison of the ICC in case they should face a process. And that is insane that the strongest military in the world says, well, if you're targeting our people, then we're going to wage war on the Netherlands. And so this is a situation that we should not have in the world, because if we have an international court, then this court has to apply for everyone without regards to where they live, to what statehood they come from, etc. I think that's very important, to what nationality have or anything, and every state should oblige to it. We have to work on this and especially I see the role of the European Union there, to do that and to moderate a process on the UN level to get all the members of the UN to fall under the legislation of the ICC, which would be very important, I believe. But for the sanction and for the issues that you mentioned, I think that's a very fair point. Again, we have a more complicated situation in the EU with when it comes to regard to sanction and also to individual sanction as well. That is taking more time because every member state, we have 27 of them, can always veto the whole process, which is insane. So whenever there's one person on them that they don't like to see on the list, they can just say, well, we'll veto the whole list or you kick them out. So as long as one of Museveni's friends has good connections to one of the member states, that can already save all of them. So I think we need to find a process that is more swift, and we'll have a process to change that in the future for the upcoming 2 years. And this is one of the major issues, because I think we need Europe to stand up for human rights and democracy in the world, and not just do it with like to support it whenever we like it and then deny it when we don't, but also to fall under the legislation of the ICC and act accordingly to our values.
Ismail, I'm very sorry, just 1 minute.
Okay.
I think we also have to acknowledge the fact that the UK has already blocked, I think, 3 of its projects in Uganda, the funding of 3 of its projects in Uganda. I think we are getting somewhere, but Nicholas, I would like you to specifically comment on the European Union representative who said that they have had a long-standing relationship with Uganda, a good long-standing relationship for over almost coming to 40 years or 35 years, and they don't want anybody to spoil it. I'm just following up on what you just said, that you don't want to antagonize anybody. So that comment was made in Uganda.
Yeah, I know. And also, this is a situation in which the European Union is very, let's say, happy to have good connections to Uganda. And this is also going in the direction that I mentioned earlier in the question of post-colonialism, because it's not having a good connection with the people of Uganda, but with the government of Uganda. There is a disparity between these two. And I think
the NRM government of Uganda. NRM government of Uganda.
Yeah. But this is a situation in which it's, of course, I mean, if you're a diplomat and you know exactly whom you have to talk to, it's way easier to do your work, right? If you have just one government that controls everything and you can deal out everything you want with them economically, etc., that's easier. But we have to face, I think what we as Europe has to do is to face what we really want to support. Do we want to support more or less democratically elected leaders that turn out to be dictators, or do we want to support the people? And I think, and our values, which are democracy and human rights. And I think, and for me personally, this is more important to stand up for human rights, for democracy, and for the people that belong to it. And that's why I'm also talking about changing the way that we fund, because I think this will trigger a long-term chain reaction. Because once you give people the possibility, so funding, to build up their community in a democratic manner, to practice out democracy, this can have a spillover effect for the whole country, which will lead to a more democratic country in general, and also a democratic government that you can act on accordingly. Because when the people learn how to use democracy to hold their representative accountable, and also representatives learn that they must not stand over the law or take funds for granted, an issue, by the way, that we still have in Europe to the day. We still have people at the moment in Germany that are using the power to make money out of it, which is sadly, I think, a thing that always comes with power. But I think when we distribute that power among the people, it can help to have, in the end, more democratic countries. And then that's something that I strive for more, to not have a good relation with the Ugandan government, but to have a good Ugandan government that is supported by the people. Mm-hmm. I'll leave it here. Yeah. And also, I want to just comment one thing in the end, because as you see, I'm very much sometimes into opposition to what the European Union does, and that's of course for the reason that I'm more or less an opposition politician, and we have a change also in the habit of the European Union itself. So the Commission itself has changed quite a lot in the past maybe 3 years, because we had a change in leadership there as well. And we hope to change that even more, but these processes just take time. But just so you're not surprised why I'm saying one thing and then the European Union does another.
Yeah, thank you very much. And I read intensively on that. You belong to the opposition side of the parliament. But also, just to bring a point through, and before I do, for those who are live on, you can raise your hand if you have a comment or question. But I would like to say this, that on January 14th, the general elections in Uganda were neither democratic or transparent. And there was use of excessive force by the police and the armed forces, and the elections, there's been growing interference in the political affairs of Uganda. So maybe for Helen and Nicholas, Ugandans may not be as, we can sit here, the four of us, we might be knowing a thing about sanctions and aid, but for a person who is there's a village called Masaka or Arua, they don't know these things. So how do we get the youth? What could be and I'll put this to Helen and maybe Slivia and Nicholas. How do we put this information to digest? Because when I'll say this to you, Nicholas, when people saw you stand in parliament, you must have seen the tweets. Your Twitter went wild because everybody was like, yeah, we have somebody on our back. But they don't know the dynamics. So how do we get, because people have lost hope. They're looking for anything that they can attach to that could give them hope. So how do we keep the hope alive for the Ugandan youth that is in Uganda? Helen, I'll start with you and then Nicholas, please.
I think, I don't know. I mean, I think the opposition at the moment is, and the people supporting it, such as Sylvia and others, I mean, I think that they're doing an amazing job, actually. And it's very, very inspiring to see what's going on, because it's not as though this all started happening on January 14th. I think we all know that human rights abuses in Uganda have a very, very long history, dating back to Museveni's seizure of power in 1986 and perhaps before. And that the world has somehow been able to kind of turn a blind eye to them for decades, decade after decade after decade, atrocity after atrocity after atrocity. And I do feel that suddenly people within the country, vulnerable as they are, and also people outside, Ugandans and non-Ugandans, see what's going on, or getting a glimmer at least of what's going on for the very first time. So I don't know. I mean, I think the future is scary, but on the other hand, I'm moved by what I see, actually, and particularly the commitment of people inside the country and their courage.
Thank you, Helen. Nicholas, please.
You know, I don't know. It's a very hard question. I don't know if you ask the right person, because for me it's very easy to say, yeah, stay strong, stay courageous, and so on. But I'm not dealing with the problems that the Ugandan youth have. To be honest, right? I have a very much easier situation to live in. Of course, we also have our struggles, but I think that the situation for the Ugandan youth is way more complicated, and that's why I'm seeing. You know, I'm all I wanted to do also with my speech was to speak with the voice of the same generation, because a lot of Ugandans are very young, and there's a lot of young people who seem to have the feeling that there can be something different, and I also share that feeling. But the spirit that I saw, and especially Helen, you already mentioned the times of 40 years ago, but there has never been a peaceful transition of power. But the situation at the moment looks like the opposition is more going in this direction of, we want peace, and we want a peaceful transition of power, and we proceed to go into the values in the process. And that is the more important thing here. And I think that is real courage. And that is something that really motivated me to also present this speech, and to try to keep up that spirit, to be peaceful, but still be courageous, still be outspoken, and still have the power to go out and say what you dream of, and act for what you hope for. And I think that is something to really take along. Of course, it is very hard, but we also have seen in history over and over and over again that a critical mass of young people, especially young people who dare to dream for something, that they can actually change the future, even in a peaceful process. Especially, for example, in Germany, we did have a peaceful revolution that was possible due to creativity and the courage of so many people to speak out for their hope. And I just can support you all to do that, to continue and to not lose hope. I think that's the first thing, to not lose hope, to continue the fight for it. And all I can do from here is really to tell you, we'll do our best to support you. At least I'll do our best as far as we can. We hope to change power in Germany as well, and maybe then we'll have more possibilities. But really, keep on the fight, but keep the fight peaceful. That would be my say to. Or that was also the thing that I wanted to say with my speech previously. And we will be in contact with the opposition, and to see that the process and the democracy in the end wins, and that there is a different future for all young Ugandans.
Thank you very much. Be peaceful, but demand for the justice. I'd like to bring in Andrea first, and then Helen for your Andrea for your comment or question, please.
Yeah, please. Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes. Okay, so I have a question for Helen, and also one for Nicholas. Hi, Helen. So my question for Helen is, where do you see the resistance in the U.S. government about cutting off military aid to Uganda, and also revisiting the question of aid? And the second question is, if Uganda claims it would stop contributing to the African troops to the African mission in Somalia and stop fighting al-Shabaab, is Uganda bluffing? Would it really stop doing that if the United States were to cut off military aid, for example? And if it did, would it make a difference in the ability of this African Union mission to fight al-Shabaab? And then I'm being very, I have another question. I'm going to put my other question to Nicholas. Nicholas, my question for you is, could you say something about U.S. military aid to Uganda, if there is any? Because you talked about the humanitarian aid, but I was also wondering about the military aid.
Thank you very much, Andrea. Harriet, if you're ready, Harriet. Harriet Nanyonga. She's not yet ready. Okay, we could have those.
I'm ready. I'm
Okay.
ready. Sorry. I just was, my question was to the member of parliament. Why is it so hard for Western governments to see that it's a plus for them to side with the young people, given the demographics of Uganda and other African nations? Why do you throw your lot, not you, but as the governments? Why do you throw your lot with an aging dictator rather than supporting the young people? Simple math, you know?
Thank you that's a very good question. Thank you very much, Harriet. For a 28-year-old Nicholas, I'll let you go first. Why do you like to, why are you dealing with a dictator, and yet the generation is full of young people?
With the old dictator that will probably at a certain stage, I don't know, dissolve itself. No, but the thing is, when, you know, I can only speculate because I'm not the one in the end doing the decision in the ministry or the commission. But I do believe that the situation is just that you know whom to talk to. And whenever you want to talk to Uganda, what do? You call the president or the foreign ministry or anything else, and they have ways and means to deliver on deals. So basically, let's say you have a deal with Uganda in what direction ever, right? Could be in any direction, but you know that they have the means to fulfill on it, and to find a way that this will also happen. And that's power. And because you want to deal with power and not, you know, take the long swing and go to the people and talk to them and then try to work around. I think that was the initial idea, and that's still the idea of the commission. But it is, and I think we see that now. Well, we should have seen that earlier, I believe, with the foreign policy, that this is not leading to the change that we hoped for, or that people hoped for maybe 50 years ago, or maybe that was never the intention. But for the changes that I see in foreign policy, expectation from also a new generation of politicians like myself in Europe is that we don't want to that we want to work on values, because this is long-term stable situation, and that can be long-term good relations that will ensure a better situation. Concerning the military aid of the US, I'm not an expert in that. The issue here is, I believe that there is also an interest from the US, for example, to sell their weapons to Uganda, because they want the Ugandans to use American weapons rather than, for example, Russian or Chinese weapons. The Ugandan army could easily get them as well. So if the US says we're not giving you this anymore, then they will go to Russia or China and get the military equipment that they need. The problem there is then the US doesn't know what they have. And this is always a good thing for military suppliers to know what the people who are purchasing your equipment, what they have in stock, because, well, you produced it for them and you shipped it for them, and so you know exactly what they're equipped with. And so I can imagine that that is a strategic approach here, one that is only possible if you focus to support dictators.
Thank you, Nicholas. There was one for Helen.
Yeah. It was kind of a two-part question, which is really a one-part question in a way. Andrea asked about resistance within the United States to changing its Uganda policy and taking a stronger stand on human rights abuses and so on. I was kind of thrilled to see that there is some bipartisan movement on Uganda, actually. There was a letter that was co-authored by Cory Booker, one of our most liberal senators, and Jim Risch, who's one of our most conservative senators in the Republican Party. And the two of them wrote together to Secretary of State Blinken, asking him a number of questions about Uganda and our support for the regime. And Secretary Blinken will answer at some point. But that was sort of nice to see. And I think, so Congress seems to be somewhat on the same page about this, which is nice, because for a long time there were members of Congress and the Senate who were very close to the regime. And I think that they are less so now. But the problem is in the Pentagon, as you suggested. And the Pentagon continues to support Uganda, as does the European Union, by the way, for their meddling, I guess, or whatever they're doing in Somalia. And Ugandans have been in Somalia since early 2007, I think, so sort of 14 years, and they're not getting too far. I mean, the thing is that mission, that African Union mission to Somalia, which is sort of a misnomer because it's our mission to Somalia, it's Europe's and the United States, has Ugandans are the biggest contingent. They're supposed to be supporting this rebel group Islamist group called Al-Shabaab. And yet the war drains on, and one doesn't really know. I mean, one thing is that Museveni has an incentive to keep the war going because he gets about $15 million a year, which he pockets from the mission. So he gets to skim off a fraction of the salary for each soldier deployed. And if you add all that up, it ends up being about $15 million a year, which he then gets to, it's just mad money for him, as far as I know. And so it's really, this is not doing Somalia any good. It's not doing the US any good for its moral position. It's not doing our taxpayers any good because we're not getting anywhere. It's certainly not doing Uganda any good because it helps Museveni entrench himself even more. So I don't know what to do about this mess. But it needs to be seriously thought about. And I think that if I were in contact with some of the people who make decisions at the Pentagon, I would definitely raise this.
Thank you very much, Helen. Two more questions and then we can wind up. I have Michael and Richard. Michael, please.
Okay, can you all hear me?
Yep.
Okay. I want to follow up on two of the questions for Nicholas. Dankeschön. It is refreshing to know that there is young representation in the European Parliament that understands, not only understands, but also supports the progress in Uganda and understands the politics and the nonsense that's going on. So there's so many that appreciate what you're doing. As far as what you were talking about with the youth, the thing that is different this time is almost everybody has a weapon in their pocket, and that weapon is their smartphone, and their smartphones are loaded with apps. They are active on WhatsApp, they're active on Twitter. So with those weapons, they are able to use information as their ammunition. They are sharing information, they are using platforms incredibly effectively. So the information's getting out there. To address what Helen was saying, and I've met with Helen a few times and read her book. It's for me, it's refreshing to know that there's somebody who has such detailed and clear understanding of the history and of the complexities of the geopolitics involved. This is not a matter of supporting Uganda. And now I'm an American citizen, I am an American taxpayer. I know that 50% of all my tax money goes to fund the Pentagon to kill people. That bothers me. So what we have in Uganda is it's not supporting Museveni or the regime, it's the fact that bad publicity is dead American soldiers coming in flag-draped coffins, returning from wars all over the world. This started under the Bush administration, and when they hired their propaganda czar, Karen Hughes, to basically promote brand red, white, and blue. And they went on a propaganda push all over the world, especially here in America, to promote the goodness of the USA. And
Michael, I would like to, do you have a question for one of our panelists, please?
It's not so much a question, but I'll just say for Nicholas and for Helen, I think an effective use of including the Black Lives Matter movement in this, because it's a matter of racism and white supremacy, that Americans don't care about dead Africans. They only care about dead Americans. So there's a movement going on, not only in the US, but all over the world about the humanity and the dignity of people of color. And that's what's going on and why we're pouring billions of dollars in the proxy wars all over the world using military contractors and using Ugandan citizens and Ugandan soldiers as just soldiers that we don't care if they die. They're doing our bidding. They're carrying our weapons into war.
All right. Thank you very much, Michael, for that. I would like to bring in a former Ugandan diplomat. I see Mr. Richard Martin Byakuleka.
Yes,
1 minute and then we could wrap this up. Martin, please.
Yeah, thank you so much. What piqued my interest was a question by Harriet Nanyonga about what we should do. But it's very important, of course, from what Helena said, and everybody knows, that the states of Europe and the states of the United States, and I should say the executives of those countries, take it as a matter of realistic politics to deal with the president of Uganda without caring, and I have liked the previous speaker's point, without caring about dead Ugandans. So it would be very, very important, of course, for us activists to try and hype onto the campaign of Black Lives Matter to expound on this issue. And lastly, of course, I would like to say that for the activists, the best strategy now is angling ourselves and presenting ourselves as an alternative to be dealt with. And one of the cardinal issues under that is to show that we are organized and have promise to become good partners in pursuit of peace in Africa.
Thank you very much, Martin. Sylvia, do you want to react to any of the statements?
Yeah, mine is in particular to the effect. I think something Helen, probably you may have to address us on how is the effect of the Ugandan army pulling out from Somalia? Because the only reason I think one of the major reasons why the Americans are very interested in the providing ammunition for Uganda is the fact that they also scratch their back by being the biggest number that actually goes to Somalia. So if Uganda says they're going to pull out because the Americans are now have put maybe a weapon embargo on them, is there any? Is it that bad? Is it going to affect?
Who cares?
The whole situation? Yeah.
Yeah.
Helen, I need you to. Yeah, sure.
Well, look, I'm not an expert on warfare and how you conduct a war and how you battle an Islamist group. But what I do know is that it isn't going well. Okay. This was supposed to be Uganda. When Uganda went in there, it was supposed to be a peacekeeping force, right? And the war was supposed to be over because the invasion of Ethiopia, which was backed by the United States with heavy weapons, incidentally, in 2006, December 2006, that was supposed to get rid of the Islamists who were in charge at the time and establish a new government, which is going to be democratic and secular and so on. That didn't happen. And I think it's time for the other shoe to drop and for the people who are really masterminding this war, which is really in our interest. I don't think Ugandans care about it very much, to really think about what a mess they've created, not only now in Somalia, but also in the troop contributing countries, particularly Uganda, but also Burundi, which is not so democratic, and so on. And we give also Kenya a free pass on corruption, Ethiopia as well, because they contribute troops. It's a bloody mess, and it's sort of spiraled out of control. And I don't know what to do, but I think they need to start thinking about it and stop doing business as usual.
And something else, Helen, there's something I think you raised with together with Nicholas about the COVID fund. There's something ongoing right now. I think, Ismail, I don't know whether you've heard about it. Is people they're using COVID as a means of torturing people. People are put in prisons and put with people with COVID so that they get infected initially. So it's at this point, I'd like to pay my respects to the late President Magufuli in Tanzania. But I think going back to my point, Helen, you cannot say you are giving Uganda even a loan for COVID, and now COVID is used as a means of torture. I don't know whether Ismail, you know about it. Yeah, you get people who have been infected with COVID and they are put in prisons, or they are put in ungazetted prisons, and they are put together with the torture victims so that they can get infected.
Yeah, and speaking about that point, thank you for bringing up as we round this up. I know that the European Union gave a very big chunk of money for COVID distribution, and there was no accountability. Almost 99% of this money went to the state house, went to Museveni. So, and the funny thing is, nobody comes out to the EU representative in Uganda cannot come out to condemn. They can't even come out to ask for accountability. So, and again, our discussion here is, yes, please, Helen.
Nicholas can ask for accountability. Nicholas, why don't you follow up? Ask what's going on. You're an elected representative. You have the right to do that.
Because this money was given for COVID. They said they will be distributing funds to help, just like in the United States. The bill was passed. Everybody who gets a certain amount of money got the $1,400. Nobody got anything in Uganda. That money went to the same people. Everybody knows these people. Europe knows these people. They continue giving visas. They allow them to continually get all these things. Get away with them. Nicholas, as we summarize.
Yes,
please.
No, I didn't know. I don't know this instance. First of all, for the question of Sylvia concerning the COVID as a weapon, let's put it this, or COVID as a torture measure. I knew that, of course, COVID measures were meant to disrupt, for example, gatherings and everything, so that information flow is just not possible. But I didn't know that, and we will follow up on that. And as well, for the COVID funds, I think we can ask for the accountability so that the European Commission can come back or can follow up. I just have to write it down, and I don't have a pen now. So that we all right. So we can see what information we can get out of there, and then I can give them also to you, Ismail, so that you can distribute to the others who might be interested as well. But just for the information, this takes 4 to 6 weeks. They have time to answer.
You can start with the ungazetted prisons, Nicholas, and they're called safe houses and prisons.
Yeah. I wanted to say one or react to one issue that I believe Martin brought up earlier, or Michael, concerning the idea of the weapon in the pocket, and that's really something that we saw in the last years, that really the informational flow is so important also, and the internet is so important to connect people, so that and that was the question that you asked earlier, how do we ensure that the people also in the remote areas and the smaller villages still know what is going on? And this really can only come from internal activists who share the information through WhatsApp or whatever. But for that, and that's a question for you too, because you mentioned the internet situation, that the internet is cut at the moment still. So how do we disrupt that? And for that, I want to make a short excursion to the spacefaring situation. As you might know, there is the Starlink project from Elon Musk to bring internet to everyone. And I'm actually also concerned with space matters in Europe, and I called for a similar approach to ensure that every European, no matter where they live, have internet connection. Now, if you have this for Europe, I mean, there's a lot of satellites in the space, then you theoretically have access everywhere on the world. It's just easier to sell to the European audience. But this could be an instrument to actually ensure that the people anywhere in the world have access to internet, because it's then not anymore controlled by the state that can just simply switch off the internet. But once you have the antenna for it, you can receive it wherever you are. And I think this could be a very helpful step for democratization for not just Uganda, but really for a lot of different countries, if Europe would stand strong, because of course Europe itself, or whoever owns the satellites, can still switch them off, and private entities tend to do that more often because they still want to do business. But the European Union, for example, if they own the satellites, could say, no, we want to have free flow of information for everyone, and therefore we will keep them up. So this is a project that taking some more time, but this could be a lesson learned out of this situation. Another lesson that I want to draw out of this is the question of democratization anyway, because I doubt that the people, maybe that's a different situation in the US, but I doubt that the people in Europe, at least not all of them, or not the majority, like to see dead bodies pile up, no matter of their skin. I do know that, of course, there are more people who, let's face it, do not care if Black people die, which is an atrocity and disgusting. But I don't think that if we have more control over the military, more democratic control, we could change it. I do believe that, especially in the US, where you see, and Helen, you said you're not a military expert. You know what? I think the Pentagon doesn't even have military expert, because if you look at the situation in Iraq, there was no strategy. There is no strategy for Al-Shabaab anyway, and they don't know how to handle terrorists. And so they don't care. They just throw money and weapons at them and hope that they disappear.
Nicholas, Ugandans failed to get Joseph Kony, a very small man in their own country. How do you send them to Somalia to get the Al-Shabaab?
Yeah, but there's no, that's a very, very much more excursus. But I think if you have a terrorist militia, there is no way to defeat them with military means. because you shoot one and two come back. It's a hydra, because once you kill a person, their brothers and sisters and sons and daughters and father and mother will then be radicalized and take up their weapons and continue the fight. And so what we need is really to ensure that not just a few elites have the power and all the means, because all the money that is going into the countries could help to deliver on a better living situation for everyone. And suddenly the urge for terrorism would decline, for radicalization, that would all decline. So this is really the direction that we need to go: more democratization, more support for the people on the ground, and more trust in the people that are living in the small communities. Even everybody living in the smallest village know what they need to support their living and to improve their region, and we should trust that knowledge and support them in that, and trust them with that.
Thank you very much, Nicholas. One final question to everybody: what do you envision the aid? I don't know if it will be easy for the current president to get sworn in. There's a very long couple months between now and then. We know that Honorable Kyagulanyi retracted his case from the Supreme Court, citing gross impunity from the court. We know that there hasn't been a statement from the EU. We know about that. But now that that has happened, what's the future of aid and sanctions and their effects on Uganda vis-a-vis next 5 years of dictatorship? As we wind down. Yeah, that's a very wide question. I see Helen is smiling. I'll go with you, Helen.
Let's hope that the dictatorship doesn't last forever. And I hesitate to predict what will happen. I simply don't know. You know, it's just, we all have to just wait and watch and pray and do what we can. And I think, you know, I think Nicholas is right that, you know, I didn't mean to suggest that we leave it all to courageous Ugandans, but people have to look for whatever opportunity they have, particularly people outside the country, but also in it. Whatever they can do that doesn't entail, you know, it entails whatever risk they're willing to take. Whenever they can take it. And that just means hard, strategic, careful work. And that's all we can do. And that means pressuring whoever you can pressure. So Nicholas, you're in a great position to pressure the Europeans. Lovely to meet you. I'm only a citizen, so there's not a whole lot I can do about my country at the moment. But a lot of Ugandans and I and some other Mzungus are working hard to pressure our representatives to change course, and it's bearing fruit a little bit. But yeah, there's the whole world. There's a whole sort of culture of you know, there's so many other groups and so many other people that have been suffering for so long. I mean, Black Lives Matter has come up, for example. You know, that there's an atrocious racial situation in this country, and that too needs to be addressed. And so there's a kind of massive culture problem in terms of our values and attitudes to human rights that really needs to be addressed more broadly as well as Uganda. And as long as things keep moving in a more open direction, then there's reason to hope, I guess.
Thank you very much, Helen. Sylvia, please, and then Nicholas.
You talked about our court situation back home. I would like just to comment about that. You know, initially, when people decide to use nonviolent means to change government and somebody uses elections, I think that is exactly what we had in Uganda. We have never had, like Nicholas said, we have never had a transition, like a democratic transition of power. We have people who are revolutionaries. They go and take over governments without actually the consent of the people of Uganda. And eventually, yeah, this was an opportunity for Uganda actually to have a good transition of power, actually a democratic transition of power, and we missed it. Even when we missed it, the people on the opposition decided to go to court and say they were not satisfied by the results of the elections. And when they went to court, We had all the injustices that actually took place eventually. In fact, when they went to court in the first place, the Kenyan situation came into my head and said, probably this time the judges are going to follow the example in Kenya and do something right for the first time. Then they missed that opportunity, and the case was actually withdrawn. When they withdrew the case, I said, good, because the Ugandan government was going to use its court system to cleanse themselves of the atrocities that had happened during the election process. Because when you go through court and eventually you don't win, they'll say, yeah, we gave you room, there was justice, we had your case, and this is what came out. So that was supposed to be a cleansing, like a cleansing process, which they missed still, and the case was withdrawn from court. After the case gets withdrawn from court, then the judges decide to undress in public, open their nakedness. In Africa, we call it opening their nakedness in public. So the injustices now have been seen at the core-most courts in Uganda. Believe me, you, Helen and Nicholas, Ugandans are desperate. I'm putting it, I love to sugarcoat. I always pray to God to help me learn how to sugarcoat. But it is what it is. Ugandans are desperate. We still have time. The president hasn't been sworn in. If you can do anything about probably avoiding maybe before the president gets sworn in, if we can cleanse our land before the president getting sworn in, we still have an opportunity. But immediately after he's sworn in May, this gentleman is going to be given a term of 5 years, which is going to make it 40 years. He came to power when I was 9 years. And now I am 45 years. So virtually he's the only president I know. That would be a reason just enough actually to wake up the entire globe. So Ugandans are desperate. And when people are desperate, they use desperate means to get out of their desperacy. It is going to be very unfortunate to dwell on the effects of things like the genocide that happened in Rwanda, yet there were signs that were shown before the genocide actually happened in Rwanda, which would have been an avenue for people to stop the genocide. But as human beings, we always wait for things to happen, and then you come in and say, now, we want to calm down the situation. For the last time, Uganda is desperate, and desperate people use desperate means. We have gone through all the avenues, elections, courts, involve the public, we've called foreigners to come and help us. International organization, the UN, please, US, we have done everything. That even in front of God, Uganda will be forgiven for whatever happens. That's all I can say.
And thank you. And one of the peaceful ways that we're dealing with this is even having these discussions online, because we know that we cannot do much. Me sitting in the United States right now, in Massachusetts, Florida for Helen, and Washington for Helen, and then Florida for Sylvia. There isn't much we can do. And we're also putting the lives of our people back in Uganda at risk by just coming here and talking about the dictatorship. So desperate people do desperate things. Nicholas, what's the future of aid, sanctions, and the dictatorship in Uganda as we wind down the show?
Well, I think we need more. We need in Europe and in the US more than just a change for the causa Uganda, because it's not a singular case in which a lot of things go tremendously wrong. I think we need to change the approach of how we do politics and how we come to the policy that we talk about. And I think there's different approaches that we need to take for the US and for the EU. For the US, for example, the state of democracy is in a very bad shape. There's this graph in which you see how favorable a law is by the population and how possible it is to get through Congress. And in theory, it should be, if it's not favorable by anyone, then it shouldn't be going through. If it's supported by everyone, it should be, it should always come through, right? So it's like a line like this. But in the US, it's like always 50%. It's always depending on how the how the lobbyists wanted to turn out, and that is a real problem for the democracy in US. And I think that is a problem why the US is waging so much war and not really caring about it, because people don't have a say in the question of where do we go and what is the strategy and which wars to support and which not. So I think this is something that you in the US have to work on, to democratize your process once more and to really come back into the line of democratic countries. In the European Union, we do have a different problem in which we simply are too democratic in order to do anything, because we simply, whenever one says, no, I don't feel happy with this decision, then we don't do it at all. And this is not a way to actually work on what you want to fulfill on. So this needs to change, and we are having a process in the next 2 years to actually change on how we do foreign policy as the European Union. I believe if the European Union would do foreign policy together and speak with one voice in every decision, and then also fulfill on this, and for example, the resolutions that we voted on, they were all voted on by 600 votes or something like that. So there was broad support from the Parliament, which is the elected body of the European people, but it wasn't delivered on by the governments or by the foreign aid policy, because we have a problem there, and we hope to change that. And once we have these politics change, I think we can then really reshape the foreign policy as we do it with the points that I spoke earlier to, and then really go into direct sanctions of dictators and their aides, not just in Uganda, but in several different countries as well, and to really nudge the countries into more democracy, to really give money directly to the people, to the NGOs, and to see that the communities build up themselves, to not just hand out handouts and gifts, but really support the people to build up their own community and get the qualification and the joy of building up everything, because I think that's what everyone wants to do anyway. Nobody wants to be living off aid, but really wants to build up their own community, and that's something that we should give a possibility to. So those are the issues where I think we need to head. What that means for the next 5 years, whether we'll have a dictatorship in Uganda, I'm not sure. I'm sorry to say that, but our processes are slow, and I will follow up with the question towards the Commission to pressurize it. We have already started the communication with all the ambassadors in Uganda from all member states, and we'll have a meeting shortly in a few weeks or days, I believe, after Easter, with them, in order to see what is going on, what they know about also the COVID funds, but also what is going on in the state and how we can pressurize. And then we will have to see to get more done with the European Council as well. But I hate to do that, but I'm a little bit more pessimistic than y'all in this regard. But maybe we have a chance to change the process. If you look on my website, you'll find a statement in which I made very clear what I think would be a very fair enough process. But because what I've never said in this whole time is I believe that Bobiwine, for example, won the election, because there is no clear evidence for that. All I know is the election that was made is not democratic. I don't know, maybe Museveni won. I don't know, but it's just clear that there's too much evidence for an unfair election that we cannot call it democratic. And therefore, if Museveni knows that he won in a certain way, right, then he could easily just have another election. We can see that to get the funding for that from foreign sources, because everybody is just not knowing who is the legitimate president. So therefore, have a new election, ensure that this election is fair, open, and democratic. Ensure that there is support from different member states, from different states of the UN or of the African Union. The European Union can help if you want to visit and to follow up on the elections and to see if everything's going well. And then we will all be happy to recognize the result that comes out. If it says Museveni, then we have to live with it. If the majority of the people decide for Museveni, then that is that. But if it says something different, then we also have to live with that. And I think that would be a very fair and good process that we should thrive for, and that we should that should be also fair enough for Museveni himself, because he says he won. So why not take a second run, because he should then win it anyway again. And one last thing I want to mention, because I was asked that in a webinar, something off topic, but I was asked this in the webinar before. This is not beer. It just looks like beer, but people think that I'm drinking beer during webinars. It's a lemonade. Just so you know.
No, thank you very much. And I need to go online and find out what that is. So thank you very much, guys, for Clubmate. Okay.
It's Clubmate. It's mate is a tea from South Africa, and also South America, from Brazil, I think, and we made out of it an iced tea. So that's a very nice drink.
Thank you very much, guys. Unfortunately we have run out of time. We can go on and on. Thank you very much, Nicholas, Member of Parliament, Member of European Parliament, sits on the Committee of Constitutional Affairs, Committee of Regional Development, and the Committee of Culture and Education. Thank you, Helen, author and Human Rights Program Professor at Bard College, New York. Thank you, Slivia, former Head of Triad Advocate LDC and former Counsel of International Criminal Court. Thank you, guys, and thank you for making time to be with us today. Good night for Nicholas, and good afternoon to the rest of the world.